Hey everyone, welcome back to Simming History, where we look at the history of architecture through the lens of The Sims. Before we get started today, if you like the video, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. May is Preservation Month, and so today we are kicking off a three-part series looking at preservation around the world. And we are starting with the U.S. and the National Historic Preservation Act. The first real preservation movement in the U.S. occurred in 1850. George Washington's home in Mount Vernon had fallen into a state of extreme disrepair, and the federal government had essentially declined to intervene. So a group of concerned citizens, all women, formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to raise the funds necessary to purchase and preserve the house. This later would serve as a blueprint for other local historical organizations and local preservation efforts. Preservation remained local, really for about 100 years after this. But we're not going to go that far ahead. We're only going to hop forward 50, and we're now in the year 1906. Now, Victorian Americans at the end of the 19th century had this nasty habit of going to national parks or public lands and, shall we say, digging up souvenirs to take home. This was seen as a threat to our cultural heritage, so Congress passed the Antiquities Act, which was then signed into law by President Teddy Roosevelt. The Antiquities Act of 1906 outlawed the practice of conducting digs on public or federal lands without permission from the government. You are also prohibited from removing any found objects. The act also granted the president the right to establish national monuments on existing public and federally owned lands. You may know a few of these created monuments, or national parks. They include Arcadia National Park and the Grand Canyon. Now we're going to hop forward to 1935. Wall Street has crashed. HABS is underway. And if you don't know what HABS is, pause the video, click on the link, go watch that video, and come back. In 1935, the Historic Sites Act is passed to establish, quote, a national policy to preserve for public use historic sites, buildings, and objects of national significance for the inspiration and benefit of the people of the United States. This act authorized the National Park Service, or NPS, to carry out programs and research, collect documents and objects related to sites, cooperate with local agencies to preserve sites, restore and maintain sites, among other things. We're now going to hop forward to 1962. It is the catalyst moment, the thing that triggers preservation as we know it today in the U.S. New York's historic Penn Station has just been demolished. It was this beautiful stone Beaux-Arts building built between 1904 and 1910. It had this massive iron and glass dome over its main concourse. It's everything you dream of today of a train station. And its modern replacement isn't nearly as spectacular. Its demolition caused international outrage and resulted in New York's landmark law of 1965. And while New York was busy passing its landmark law, President Lyndon B. Johnson was busy commissioning a report on the status of historic preservation in the U.S. That report was titled, With Heritage So Rich, and it was damning. HABS had been in place for over 30 years and had recorded over 12,000 structures. But by 1965, over half of them had been demolished. The committee wrote in the report that HABS was, quote, the death mask of America. And they insisted the federal government needed to take control. Before the end of 1965, Congress pushed through the National Historic Preservation Act. And in October 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson officially signed the National Historic Preservation Act into law. This act did a number of things. It formally established an authority and process for preservation, which was under the authority of the Secretary of the Interior. It created the National Register of Historic Places, which is maintained by the National Park Service, which is also under the Secretary of the Interior. It established the State Historic Preservation Offices, or SHPO, and it established the President's Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. The National Register is a list of historically significant properties. Eligibility is based on two factors: age/integrity and significance. First, the building must be at least 50 years old and still appear much as like it did originally, age and integrity. Second, the property must also be significant, related to an important event, activity, person, or development. And yes, architectural significance does count. Now, it's important to understand that being listed does not protect a privately owned property from demolition. That's a major difference between us and some other countries' preservation laws. All projects using federal funds or on federal land must undergo the Section 106 review process to determine whether the proposed work would be harmful to the site and to minimize that harm. These reviews are conducted by MPS for federal lands or if federal grants are involved. The Act also established the SHPOs, State Historic Preservation Offices, and there's an office for every single state and every single U.S. territory, even Guam. Their job is to oversee the Section 106 reviews within their own states or territories. Now, this probably doesn't come as a surprise to most, but the U.S. preservation system is reliant on incentives, primarily tax incentives, rewards, and grants to encourage private home and business owners to preserve rather than demolish their historic properties. Essentially, if you're willing to preserve, you get rewarded. And there have, of course, been other preservation laws since the big one. There were two more archaeological preservation acts in 74 and 79, acts addressing underwater resources like shipwrecks in 87 and 1990, and another big one, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, in 1990. If you're interested in any of these acts or any of the ones I've mentioned before, there'll be links down below with more information. Today, the NPS and SHPOs use the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, linked below, to determine if the work being done is in the best interest of the property. These standards have their own history. The first edition wasn't published until 1977, although the National Historic Preservation Act did kick off the creation of these guidelines. And today we are using the 2017 edition. It covers the recommended treatment for preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction, and it's essentially the guidelines that are used by either NPS or SHPO when conducting the Section 106 review. Preservation covers when you preserve and stabilize a building. You are neither adding nor taking away. So if, for example, you have a piece of trim that's had a lot of paint layers applied over the years, you aren't stripping that paint. You're leaving it there as a record. Related, but sort of opposite to that, is restoration. Restoration is where you are taking a building in its entirety to a period of significance, literally the period of history in which that building's was its most significant. In our wood trim analogy, it means you'd be stripping that wood trim down to the paint color that trim was painted during that time. So you're taking away. Rehabilitation is when you turn a historic home into a modern business or something similar. And reconstruction is exactly what it sounds like. You rebuild something that is no longer there. We'll cover the standards in a future video in more depth. The important takeaway for how preservation is conducted in the U.S. is this. Everything is under the umbrella of the Secretary of the Interior, which includes the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Offices. The Secretary of Interior issues standards that act as guidelines for preservation, restoration, and protection of historic structures. NPS and SHPO use these guidelines to determine whether projects are in compliance. If your project is in compliance, you can get tax breaks or other financial incentives to preserve rather than demolish. There is no law saying you can't tear down a historic property in the U.S. In fact, the only way to guarantee a property is totally protected is to have a historic covenant get placed on that property. It acts kind of like a lien in that it prevents any future owners from making any significant changes to the architecture. So, you may be wondering, what have I been building this whole time? Well, I've been talking about historic preservation in the U.S. I had initially planned on building for this video the first home listed on the National Register. Seemed like a really clear idea. But here's the thing. When the National Register was founded in 1966, a lot of sites got listed all at once. So there really isn't a first. Sites from every single territory and every single state all got listed on the same day. So instead, I'm building a site that is on HABs. It received an honorable mention in 1987. It is on the National Register. It was inducted May 29th of 1979 and is on the 2024 list of America's Most Endangered Historic Places, which is published by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, in case you're wondering, acts as sort of our national historical society. Every state has a historical society. Lots of cities have their own local historical societies. National Trust is sort of our national one. This is the Hudson-Athens Lighthouse, built in 1847 in the middle of the Hudson River in New York. It is still active. It has been in operation for over 150 years. It's also now a public museum. Lightkeepers and their families lived on this site until the 1940s, which makes sense. It literally just looks like a brick house that has a light on top. It is built on 200 wood pilings driven into the riverbed, which have become endangered due to erosion from increasing ship size, ice dams, and currents. Some of the pilings are no longer even supporting the building. It is estimated it may collapse within 3 years if no action is taken to re-secure the foundations. The Hudson-Athens Lighthouse Preservation Society is working to raise funds to preserve the lighthouse with what they call the 100-year fix. And if you're interested to find out more about this building, how you can help, and what that plan is, I have included a link down below. Unsurprisingly, the primary source for today's video is very fittingly the National Park Service. And if I haven't said it enough, I'll say it again. Links are down below with more info. Thanks for joining me today. Next time, preservation in Britain. They don't rely on tax incentives. Spoiler. Thanks to all the new subs. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe. Thanks to all my old subs for sticking around. I will see you all soon. Bye.